actually dead cells, right? Because they've finished their life cycle, they've fermented away, they've dropped out to the bottom. But there is so much yeast, and it's so aggressive that there is enough living cells to start the next round over again.
And so can you split those, or does your yeast just keep getting bigger and bigger, or?
Yeah, I think, if you were to keep the same volume every time, it would just get bigger and bigger.
This is all very interesting. I feel like...
I know.
So say maybe in these... I'm not in the brewery. I don't do the brewing,
Right.
so this is just an example. But maybe you put a half gallon of yeast slurry in, but by the end you have 5 gallons worth. Because it's divided and multiplied and grown.
Right. So then
But then you take a half gallon of that and start it over again.
Okay, all right. Now, there we go.
You
I'm like,
see?
so I get it
And
now.
then a lot of yeast does go down the drain, really.
Down the drain and in the bottle. Not
Yes,
a lot
not
in the
a lot
bottle.
in the bottle.
But there's still some.
Yeah, so the goal is that by the time it's hitting the bottle or the keg, that there's not a lot of yeast left.
And then I think my last question on this line of questioning.
Sure.
Before we get into the art. Art is a huge favorite of mine. So right before we get into that, you guys rent the farmhouse up in Newcastle.
We do.
And we were talking earlier about how we want to have a girls' retreat.
Yes,
Awesome.
please.
And so what would the possibility be of making a cool ship, great beer adventure beer?
Oh, really?
Cool ship just lends itself.
Well, interesting. Well, I know we are going to be using the cool ship again this fall. Ooh. And if
I love fall.
If I can try and sneakily figure out the dates, perhaps you could coincidentally be renting the farmhouse at the same time.
That sounds perfect.
Because
You
then
got
you
my
could
email address.
at least observe the cool ship.
That would be lovely.
Maybe hang out with it overnight.
Just
Like, hey, cool ship.
Cool ship. Take a trip on the cool ship. Pretty
That would
much.
be great. That would be
has
so
to
much
happen.
fun. Okay, so a love of mine is art. Any kind of art. I actually use beer bottles to make printing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
If you wanna see more about that, you can go over to greatbeeradventure.com/beerart. Maybe you'll see that. But
Amazing.
yeah, so I saw your exhibit. You made an exhibit with yeast.
Yes.
And it was called Beer DNA, and I was like, I'm going. Like, I have to go.
Of course,
like,
yes.
beer art. And I came in
Yeah.
that night that you first opened it, and the art was beautiful.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you.
so
It
gorgeous. Can you explain to us, first, how you came up with the idea?
Sure.
And second, how you did it?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tackle
great.
both those things.
Good.
So, by training, I'm a marine scientist, like you said earlier, and I finished grad school, and my husband and I moved to Newcastle, where I took a job in a molecular lab. So I did genetics work in grad school and for my first job. And we bought that Newcastle property because my job was up there with no real intention of starting Oxbow. Mm-hmm. And then kind of things evolved. And a year later, Tim came up and the guys started talking. And next thing we knew, we had a brewery at the property. And so I left my job to start helping with Oxbow. And 5 years later, I'm still here, which is awesome. But all along, I've gone in and out of Oxbow a little bit, trying to keep my science up on the side. So I got an independent grant with the monk seals that we talked about. So I was working on that 1 or 2 days a week for a while. And then I took a job last fall teaching at Bowdoin, which was really cool. But
very
all
nice.
along, I kind of keep coming back to Oxbow. It just seems to be where the priority lies right now, which is obviously great, right? But there's this huge part of me that loves science. And I just was always trying to find a way to kind of integrate the two. And then years ago, Jeff had seen some of my gels and thought they were beautiful. And I was kind of like, brushed it off a little bit. But somewhere along the way, and I've been working on this project for 2 years. So somewhere along the way, a couple years ago, I just decided that I wanted to try and make some DNA art. It just seemed like a really cool... I used to be really into crafting. I sew and knit, and I do love art and crafting. And so I was like, I'm going to try and make some DNA art. And I realized I needed a really accessible and fairly easy study species to start R&D with. And I was like, I I know. We have fermenters full of yeast. That is so easy to get the DNA from. So I grabbed a sample of our yeast and went off to the lab with it. I approached Rising Tide and Bunker. They're good friends of ours, and said, hey, you guys want to throw me a tablespoon of yeast? I'm trying this little project. They're like, sure. And it took me about a year and a half of R&D to figure out how to do it. And I just ended up having so much fun and falling in love with these images. So I sent a huge email out to a bunch of Maine brewers and said, hey folks, I'm doing this DNA art project. And basically the whole point, it was really fun for me integrating science, art, and then of course, our whole world of beer into one thing. But also, yeast, like I was saying before, it's a really important part of the brewing process. People have a lot of pride in their yeast. People have a lot of, they're very protective over their yeast. A lot of these are house yeast strains that people worked really hard to propagate. And so I just wanted to kind of show the differences of every Maine brewery. Every yeast is genetically different, and just kind of show how beautiful those differences can be.
Now, not to give away any of your secrets, but how did you actually
do the work? Yeah. So basically, I went to the breweries and collected a yeast sample. All of them came from a fermenter, so it was after a beer had been brewed. A couple came from a propagation tank, but for the most part, they all came from the fermenter. And again, just about a tablespoon is all I needed. So brought that back to the lab, extract the DNA out of it, which essentially for yeast is just boiling it. With one chemical that just helps burst the cells open. So extract the DNA. And then I put it in this machine called a PCR machine. And what the PCR machine does is it makes millions of copies of this one gene region I was interested in. And then once you have those millions of copies of the DNA, you can run them on these agarose gels. So they're they're almost like Jell-O. And they're not Jell-O, but they're kind of, that's how you would imagine it. It's made out of agar. But so these agarose gels, and then you can load the DNA into these little lanes, and there's a dye in the gel. And then DNA is negatively charged. So you run an electric current through the gel, and the DNA travels to the positive end of the gel. And as it's traveling through the Jell-O, through these little, microscopic pathways, it's picking up dye, stain. You hit it with a fluorescent light, and then you can see those bands. They just pop out of nowhere. So it's really cool. You put them on this gel, you run it, and at the very end you turn on a light, and then you see these bands. Then that's actually what you were seeing in the art, was these bands of millions of copies of the gene. Okay. I took a photograph with just an SLR camera.
Wow.
And then it went into post-production in Photoshop for all the color manipulation.
Oh.
And what's really neat is that every sample was treated identically in the lab. So any difference you saw in the art is a true genetic difference between two samples.
Wow. So the coloring, is that scientific or is that Photoshop?
The coloring is totally artistic preference. It's just what I imagined this brewery's yeast DNA should look like.
Nice.
Or this beer or this style or whatever.
And
So I really sat down and put a lot of time into the lab procedure to make it visually look how I wanted it to look. And then I put a lot of time into the post-production to make the colors.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because as I was looking at the pictures, I would read the name of the brewery and be like, yeah, that color makes sense. So to hear you actually say, yeah, I thought about them.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now I see. Yeah. I didn't know how they had gotten their colors. So
yeah.
And I think you did a great job.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
I would say, how many of them were there total?
So there were 20 images, 16 different breweries. So a few of them had 2 images done.
Yeah, I would say I could have guessed a good 15 of them based on the coloring themselves.
And I think it's funny, a lot of people, I think, would be looking at them, and then they would say, oh, wait, who's that one? And I would tell them, they'd be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So...
yeah,
it's so fun. It sounds like you had a lot of fun.
I had a ton of fun doing this project. A ton of fun. Yeah.
And now, the originals. Well, are there originals or are they all prints?
Yeah. So they're prints. They are digital inkjet, archival inkjet on fine art paper prints. And I'm doing 25 prints per image. So each one of them is a series of 25 prints.
Okay.
And so, and I was there for sale. So,
Where
framed or unframed.
Where can you find them?
On my website at dashmasland.com. And and I do have some originals from the wall still, print number 1 in the series.
Oh,
Nice.
Yeah, they are
Very
absolutely gorgeous.
How
If you
fun.
have not seen them yet, make sure you go to Dash Masland. That was a keg.
That's just okay.
That was a keg. So make sure you go to dashmasland.com and check them out because they are amazing.
Aw,
if you
thank
are
you.
a beer connoisseur, this is a fine art piece to put up. It's not that Miller Lite sign.
no,
This is the
no.
one you can put in the living room, not hide in the man cave.
Yes.
This is one that
Everyone
is
will like
gorgeous. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Thank you, guys.
Well
Wow,
done.
that's so fun to hear about.
Thank you. Yeah,
That's
it was
great.
really a lot of fun to do.
I like that you showcase art here too at the.
I know.
It's
That worked out well that we have an art wall here.
Yeah. I'm really a big fan. Big fan.
Yeah. I might have known someone who helped me get the art on the wall, but hey, it was a great show.
I'm glad you
Yes.
do that though, because you have not only that, but the art on the walls, literally graffiti. We
Yeah.
are sitting here looking at this beautiful graffiti and skateboards and
Yeah, and all of our labels are custom done art by a good friend of ours. I mean, we're definitely a very artistic and visually focused brewery.
yes.
All of us. My husband makes beautiful art, and Tim loves to do graffiti art, and like I
Yes,
said, Will
all
does all
over
of
the
our
kegs.
beautiful, beautiful labels, and so it's a big part of who we are at Oxbow.
And the wall that Jen was talking about actually is an installation. It changes.
Yeah, so that's in the tasting room. So the graffiti's kind of all over the walls of the warehouse, but in the tasting room is a beautiful, just huge white art wall, and that has rotating shows every 2 months. So everyone who goes up for about 8 weeks, and we have artists booked through the end of the year. So we've got a
Great.
ton of great shows coming up.
That's so
Yeah.
wonderful.
Thank you,
I
yeah.
cannot.
Do you have like an opening when the
Yeah, we
shows
do.
change?
Yeah, we do.
Nice.
We do an art opening for each show. We tend to
Nice.
try and do it usually like the second Friday of the month, because
Instead
First
of
Friday,
first,
we're not
right.
really quite, we love First Friday, but we're not quite in the heart of the arts district, so it's a little hard to do it at the same time.
Gotcha,
Here
that's
in
smart.
Portland, Maine, on the first Friday of every month, there is an art walk, and it has become this amazing. It's a new word I just
Amazing.
made.
Amazing, actually. Raging and amazing is.
And major, kind of all of them
Major.
together.
Wow.
But this
It's true.
amazing thing that just kind of takes over the entire arts district
Yeah.
here in the city.
It's incredible.
So I think at this point we are going to move on to our third round.
Excellent.
I will take that round. What we would love to hear is your first beer memory.
Well, I was thinking a little bit about that, and it's funny. So my first beer memory, I grew up in Maine, right? So we have a lot of craft beer here, and we have for most of my life, because some of the veterans have been around for 20 or 30 years. So I definitely remember, as a young rebellious youth, when we would ask for someone to go purchase us some beverages for the weekend, it just always cracks me up. And I can remember telling people this in college and stuff. It's that we were never going for the cans of Budweiser as young high schoolers. We were always going for the Shipyard or the Geary's, which were the craft beers at the time.
Right.
So that
Nice.
really stands out to me about my childhood, is that our first kind of. But then kind of the most memorable beer moment for me is, so I got diagnosed with a gluten allergy about 6 months before Oxbow, but I was not very good at first because it was really hard. I've since had to become much better about it. But I do remember really clearly the first time we ever tried one of our commercial brews out of the fermenter, and it was my husband, Jeff, Tim, and myself. It was just the three of us starting this brewery, and I can still remember sitting on the front porch of Oxbow, Tim pouring a beer out right straight out of the fermenter and sitting down and being like, "All right, guys, this is it."
Wow.
And I just that memory will never fade from my mind.
Right.
What an amazing experience that was. So
Absolutely. What a great.
yeah,
thank
from
you.
like a rundown barn to a commercial brewery, and that's really memorable.
That's something to be
so.
proud of.
Yeah,
It is.
yeah.
Did you said you grew up in Maine? Whereabouts?
I grew up in Yarmouth, so right outside of Portland.
So So that completely negates my question. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Maine.
Okay.
And we had things called pit parties.
Yeah.
Have you
Yes.
even heard of one of those?
No.
I have.
Although we used to party in the sand